that, and then we'll unmute Juliet and Pat Jodice, who's joined us today. Hey, Juliet. Hey, Pat. Nice to see you.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hey.
So yes, we start off with a Pelican paper, and which is led by Juliet Lamb, Ivan Sadje from Clemson University, and online we also have Pat Jodice from USGS. Thanks for joining. And Juliet, my little finger tells me that you're now doing a postdoc in France, and you're already fed up with French admin. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary.
Yeah. Well, guess what? We've been dealing with that for decades, and we still do seabird research. Isn't that wonderful?
I'm very impressed.
Yes, we were happy to select your paper for quite a few reasons. The first is that there aren't that many tracking papers on pelicans. Well, I guess after your PhD, there's much more known on tracking in pelicans. So we found cool to report on that species, because otherwise, often tons of studies, especially tracking studies, are done on always the same species. So that was a nice change. And also there aren't that many species which track seabird movements year round. So we thought that that was a strength of your paper. And finally, there aren't that many studies, and you stress this in the introduction, which deal with seabird habitat selection within the coastal zone. And a lot of such studies are done with more pelagic species. So you tracked 77 brown pelicans from 6 colonies in the Gulf of Mexico. And these colonies went in pairs for the eastern, the central, and the western sector of the Gulf of Mexico. And using the tracking data, you showed that they use the whole of the coastal zone in the Gulf of Mexico on a year-round basis, well, across the year cycle, really from Florida, Cuba to Yucatan, and with some birds even spreading a little bit into the Pacific Ocean. They do this by crossing Mexico, and I understand that you have another paper which deals specifically with that aspect of birds crossing that isthmus. And the 3 blocks you used overlapped with respect to the central and the western colonies by 30 to 40%. So there was quite a lot of overlap in their home ranges, but you found that the eastern breeders only overlapped to 15% with the other ones. So they were split from the rest. But overall, you confirm that the pelicans really like estuaries, and their preferred areas are within highly productive zones of these estuaries, and that might be problematic because, of course, estuaries are also very often shipping hubs and ports. And very interestingly, you show, and I think that was probably unexpected, a strong link with salinity gradients, and that came as a surprise. And the interpretation you give was that the birds may track fronts within the estuaries, and these fronts aggregating prey. And another important result was that there was a restricted availability of preferred habitats during the post-breeding molt, and that links very nicely, I think, with quite a few other seabird tracking studies, which now show that the post-breeding molt is really a critical period, and might be also an energetic bottleneck with population implication. And during that molt, all the pelicans you studied, well, most of them seems to be gathering within the Mississippi Delta, and that of course has conservation implications, because that part of the world is known as a hotspot for shipping, oil extraction, and contaminants loads in North America. And the final, well, one of the final key points you make is that in these habitats, the pelicans, they work pretty much as umbrella species for a whole community of water birds. So congratulations on that study. Especially, I found the visuals in the paper really appealing and clear. And when you speak about pelicans as umbrella species for other water birds, do you mainly think about pelicans maybe facilitating feeding for other species, or what sort of aspects do you have in mind?
I think particularly the fact that pelicans have kind of a unique foraging strategy where they require these really large aggregations of prey. They're not single prey loaders that are going after, one fish at a time. They're scooping up huge amounts of fish. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons to think of them as being maybe an umbrella species, because they encompass these habitats where there are kind of gatherings of fish. And we found, the relationship with salinity and productivity as well that seems to indicate that they're choosing these really highly productive spots where they can get all the energy that they need. I think there's kind of a good reason to believe that because of their higher energetic requirements and their kind of unique foraging strategy, that they sort of are extreme in their reliance on these really, really highly productive habitats, but that other seabirds are kind of queuing to the same things at maybe slightly less extreme level.
And speaking more specifically about the Mississippi Delta, will your findings have conservation implications in terms of focused conservation of the key habitats you identified, especially during the, for instance, the molting period?
Well, there's definitely a lot going on in conservation in the Gulf right now, and I might let Pat talk about that a little bit more specifically, just because it's a very interesting system, and there's kind of not a lot of work being done on seabirds there, although probably more so as money continues to enter the Gulf. But the genesis of my study really goes back to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that happened in 2010, and given the lags that are inherent in administrative processes, the restoration funds that came out of that spill that were paid by BP and others are just now kind of coming through the pipeline and starting to fund actual research. So having some baseline information on what's going on in these kind of hotspots of overlap between, important areas for birds and other marine wildlife and sort of hotspots of pollution and economic activity, as you mentioned, are really important to provide, some direction for the channeling of restoration funding into the areas where it can be most useful. Pat, do you have any kind of more sort of up-to-date insights on that?
Yeah, so Juliet makes a really good point. When the spill occurred back in 2010, those of us who were engaged with that, we had really very little baseline information. As high profile and iconic as brown pelicans were, you would think there'd be all this background information. But even in terms of movement data, we were relying on a couple of, very few records of birds that had been VHF tracked in California in the 80s. Like, that's really what we were going off of. We didn't have much other data. So all those 70 plus birds that Julia talked about, they really added a lot to our understanding way after the spill. In terms of current use for one really good example is there's a lot of effort being put into building islands now within the Gulf for seabirds. Juliet has participated in some of these conversations herself. Those data are being used frequently to help guide some of those decisions in terms of foraging ranges, habitat use, foraging needs. So the data are being applied directly to these restoration island building decisions. And also, honestly, that project in its total, as you mentioned, there's other papers that have come out of that, is serving as a model for what we need to do with other taxa, because you referenced other species that perhaps brown pelicans are serving as an umbrella for these other species. They might be, but none of those other species have been tracked. Really, brown pelicans are the only ones that have had that level of effort. So the terns that are there, the skimmers that are there, are still really we're still really way behind on that curve of understanding. And so we're using Juliet's papers as a model for what we could do with these other species.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have maybe one just technical question before Grant takes over, and then we open the questions to the audience. I was just curious on whether and how the birds get rid of the harness I know that Juliet has yet another paper on potential impacts of the tags. So maybe she wants to comment on this.
Yeah, we don't have a built-in mechanism where the harness actually falls off eventually, because we were working with another researcher who'd done work on pelicans in the past, and he found that putting in kind of a weak link in the harness ended up just making part of the harness fall off and part of it stay on, and it became kind of an even worse situation than having a harness attached to the bird. So we didn't build them with any particular kind of timeline, but the transmitters that we used were solar powered. So we figured we'd just keep collecting data from the transmitters for the life of the transmitter or the life of the bird. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be done with harnesses in particular. I don't feel, you know, 100% confident that harnesses that we used are really the best way to go. And we did find some effects. They seem to adjust pretty quickly, but kind of the main, I think, caveat to that is that they have to be fitted really well. And pelicans at least seem to fluctuate a lot between the breeding season and then the non-breeding season when prey are more limited, especially birds that stay resident in areas that are fairly seasonal. They lose a lot of weight during non-breeding. So we did have some birds going into rehab centers with the harnesses becoming looser and kind of moving around on the bird and causing some abrasions. So I think there's, I know there are, you know, various research groups that are working on designing better harnesses and having a really tough time with it. I think seabirds are so sort of carefully calibrated in how they use energy that any harness is going to cause potentially some problems for them, and trying to continue to figure out how to minimize those problems is, I think, a really important avenue for people to be working on. So we tried to contribute to that as far as we could with our study.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess that initially, because the pelicans really don't dive that much, you know, the shape of the body doesn't get transformed as much as in divers, and hence probably at least initially, you know, the harness is less of a problem. But yeah, it's a big issue in seabirds, I guess. Well, I still have a question, but I'll keep it maybe for later on. Grant, do you have any?
Yeah, of course. I always have questions. Before I go, I realized I hope so. I just realized though that I've been giving everyone the virtual tour of my terribly disorganized office. So I'm going to switch to a penguin. It's a little bit more appealing.
That is terrifying.
This is Jim. Right. So my question was kind of related a little bit to what David had mentioned before about how the fact that, you know, we don't focus a lot on these coastal species. Very rarely we see them tracked. I mean, we focused almost entirely on pelagic species. So looking through what you did, you used a lot of environmental parameters in your models that are typically used sort of in pelagic environments, with the exception of, say, runoff and all that sort of stuff. But I'm curious as to if you think there might be any influence from terrestrial factors, say industrial development. You know, are birds avoiding those areas more than others, or you know, obviously shipping lanes and things like that. Did you investigate any of that by any chance?
Yeah, I mean, even things that, you know, that are used in offshore environments are very different in nearshore environments. Like you think of something like net primary production in an offshore environment, it's sort of entirely natural, I guess. But in an environment like the Gulf of Mexico, you get hypoxic zones that develop because of runoff from river plumes. So there's obviously this interaction between what's going on in the land environment and the sea environment. And I think that's a really, really cool avenue. And as you said, something that not a lot of people study, because we all want to go off on, you know, the islands in the middle of nowhere and work on the really sexy species, but nobody wants to go hang out in like a port and tag a bunch of pelicans. But yeah, I think there is some really good work coming out of, like, especially I think University of Washington, some of the researchers there are doing some work on river plumes and nearshore seabirds and how they kind of interact with those features. So there are definitely features that are kind of unique to coastal landscapes that I think are really shaping how birds use them. And then as far as kind of the human side, there's probably a lot of facilitation with vessels, especially shrimp trawlers, I know is something that Pat's looking at in the Atlantic with pelican movements. And you know, in the Gulf, there's not really good vessel monitoring data like there are from Europe. I'm always really jealous of those studies where there's real-time seabird tracking data and vessel monitoring data, because we don't have that at all. It's like nobody really wants to talk about what they're doing. It's very kind of cloak and dagger. Not,
yeah, it's quite cool, because I mean you're working with such a I guess what you would almost consider a not really a sexy species. I mean, you look, their chicks are hilarious because they look like little dinosaurs, but they're huge. I mean, they're, you know, very large, robust birds, and you could imagine doing something similar with them, like what Henri Wiemerskirch and that crowd did, where they attached the AIS tags on the birds as well that actually detect ships at the same time. I didn't know. You're trying?
We're trying, yeah. We're doing some. We're trying to mimic Juliet's project to a certain extent in the Atlantic as well. And as she said, the interaction with fishing vessels is really challenging. But we know that they interact a lot with shrimp trawlers. These shrimp trawlers are sort of day trawlers, so they're well within the coastal zone, well within their reach. And we're trying to get a much better handle on that, because it. You know, one of the things we don't fully understand is the difference in the diet when they can access these shrimp trawlers and when they cannot. But it seems like when they can get these shrimp trawlers, their diets can change substantially. The diet quality doesn't seem to change all too much. These kind of lower latitude fish all seem to be about the same, but we are wondering if there's a difference in contaminant loads because the shrimp trawlers are bringing up benthic fish, and normally these birds are not getting benthic fish, right? So that's a whole other question that we're kind of trying to figure out. So yeah, the radar tags are something we've been trying to figure out and see if it's something we can access.
Yeah, I think that would be quite cool. Again, you know, like looking at this issue of the fact that these birds are so coastal, which is something we don't often look at in tracking studies. The other quick question I had for you too, and I think you may have already touched on this a little bit, is the vulnerability of these birds to contaminants and pollution and pollutants that may be coming downstream, you know, say from the Mississippi. Do you reckon that there are temporal effects that you might be detecting? Say, are there times of the year when there's more pollution at the mouth of the Mississippi than there would be at other times of the year? I don't know much about like industrial waste loads or anything like that, but are there timing issues that could be impacting the birds if they're there at the same time as, say, a coal plant is dumping a bunch of tailings into a river upstream?
Yeah, I mean, runoff and river flow are super seasonal, so that depends a lot on precipitation upstream, and that kind of coincides, like the heavy precipitation coincides with kind of the spring when people are putting down fertilizer. So that seems to be like when birds are arriving, but maybe back at the breeding sites might be kind of a hot spot for pollution. But we have some preliminary work, I think, that just came out. We're collaborating with some people that are more specialized in contaminants to get some baseline data on that. We also have some data on PAH levels that hopefully we'll be able to publish pretty soon. So we're kind of getting a handle, not necessarily on anything as fine scale as seasonal fluctuations, just because, you know, we only collected data over kind of a limited time scale. But we do have both blood and feather samples, so we can compare a little bit between, you know, the period of feather growth versus the more immediate period where contaminants would be represented in blood samples. So hopefully stay tuned. You might be able to hear a bit more about that in the future.
Sweet. Looking forward to it. All right, I think with that, we'll open it up to any questions we might have from the audience. I'm sure there must be somebody out there with a burning question. Nobody. I see no raised hands at all. There must be at least one person out there who wants to raise their hand. David, maybe you can prompt somebody with some more discussion.
Yes, I was very curious to know what these pelicans do when a hurricane comes across.
Well, that's another question I can answer for you.
Mm-hmm.
So we, I don't know if you asked that on purpose or not, David, but so we just had a paper come out from the Atlantic work from a current PhD student, Brad Wilkinson, who I just got a text from, is just got back from a colony this morning. And so, you know, same thing, coastal species on the Atlantic side instead of the Gulf. And we were just opportunistic to have satellite tags on pelicans during 3 tropical storms, which hit directly where we were, but were well within the wind swath. And so that paper movement ecology just a couple of issues ago, or maybe even the last issue. So if people are interested, they can look there, and I can give you the short answer, which is they kind of sit tight and don't do much. He used the EMBC in our package to look at clustering their behaviors based on the satellite tracks, and they go into basically a no movement scenario. From the other parts of that that's really interesting, I mean, you can look at it for the EMBC part, which is really cool. He did a nice job with that. But from a conservation perspective, what's really cool is they go kind of inland, and they're going to areas that we might not normally think of protecting for coastal birds. And that even includes anthropogenic structures like bridges. And so I think the next question to answer there for us is, okay, yeah, they sit tight. If storms change in frequency or size, how long are they sitting for? How many days might they not be foraging? If that's during chick rearing season, what kind of an impact might that have? We don't have answers to those questions yet. But then what are the habitats that they're using, and are those habitats part of conservation plans or protection, or are they potentially slated to be developed? So I think that's an interesting part to that. It would be interesting to look at it in the Gulf, because it really is a different system. The storms are different in size and intensity as well. So we just have to be opportunistic and have tags out when it happens.
Yeah, it seems like they're large enough not to get blown around a lot by hurricanes. They kind of just sit where they are. But I know there's a lot of difference depending on the time of year and sort of how good condition they're in. And yeah, we only have kind of the basic correlations in the Gulf. It would be cool to look at that there as well.
And to go back to your analysis, Juliet, for pelicans, which would be, for instance, in Texas, how long would they need to then go, for instance, to Yucatan or the easternmost part of the range you showed on the maps, to give us an idea of how quickly or slowly they move through the landscape?
Their actual flights are pretty quick. They tend to kind of stop over at various sites along the way. But the pelicans that cross directly across the Gulf, it's usually within a day, sometimes overnight on an oil platform somewhere offshore, and then continue. And then you mentioned the birds that migrate across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is the narrow point of Mexico. They go over about 200 kilometers of land to get to the Pacific side. They usually do that in less than a day. It's kind of like a half trip maybe. So when they're flying, they're really flying, but they tend to do it in kind of hops rather than long trips without stopping.
Yeah, and yeah, when they fly over land, how high do they fly then?
We don't have good measurements of altitude, but there aren't a lot of observations. Like there are a lot of wind farms in that area where they have visual observations, and they don't really see brown pelicans flying very much. So we assume they must be flying pretty high to go undetected. But yeah, that's kind of a blank spot in the whole altitude part of the migration is really interesting, and something that, in retrospect, I wish we'd been able to have on the transmitters as well to get a better idea of that.
Yeah. Do people sometimes describe the whole of the Gulf of Mexico as something in a kidney or bean shape? Is that image used sometimes?
I don't know if I've ever heard kidney, but
yeah,
sure.
because when we're looking at your habitat maps, if you look at them from a distance, it looks like an inflamed kidney. You would detect. The shape was really interesting with these prefed habitats all around that kidney shape.
Yeah, and it made them all red and yellow too. So
yeah.
Probably.
Are you sure you just?
I didn't think it was possible for this to be less sexy, but I think you just managed it.
I was gonna say, what have you been worried about lately? All right, we've got a
psychology session.
I know. we got a question from Michael Shrimp. Oh, and Emily's there too. Look at that. I'm gonna unmute you guys. Hey guys, how's it going? Oh, I don't know if I've accidentally muted you after clicking on mute. Hang on a second. I've clicked on mute, but it's taking a minute to register, I think. Unmute. Oh, there we go. Hey guys.
Hey Juliet.
Hey Mike.
So I had a quick question. I don't know. I mean, we've heard a bunch, and some of the stuff that I'm interested in involve associations among species. And I know that you were just tagging the pelicans here, but I was curious if you or maybe Pat are aware of any positive associations, mutualistic associations between the pelicans and either other birds or other marine mammals, for example, in terms of where they feed or when they feed or how they feed. And if that would potentially affect any sort of relationships or in terms of where you see them.
I mean, really only anecdotally, but they tend to nest in colonies with tern species in the Gulf. There's royal terns and sandwich terns, and often with wading birds as well in some of the nearshore colonies. So there'll be, egrets and herons nesting in part of the island and pelicans nesting in other parts of the island. So at least during breeding, there seems to be at least a spatial association. I don't know what that sort of translates to in terms of foraging, blocking, anything like that. And then when they're feeding, you often see terns feeding kind of mixed in with pelicans. But again, that's, only anecdotal. So it'd be really good to get some additional data from other species to kind of see what those associations are actually looking like in real time.
Oh. Sorry, Pat's been muted. Hang on a second. He's hopefully going to come back in a second here now. There we go. You're back, Pat.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I muted myself because I was typing. So the other answer, I think, Michael, one of the species where there might be some overlap are these certain stocks of dolphins, of bottlenose dolphins that we have in the Gulf and in the Atlantic. There's a cohort they refer to as the bay and estuary stock or something like that. And based on some maps I've seen from those, I think there might be at least a substantial amount of spatial overlap in foraging between like Juliet's data and what she's shown and what they've shown. And that's something that we've been wanting to look into and just haven't had the time. But I think just simply overlapping those two species could be really interesting.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Emily. All right, we got a question from Kyle. All right, let's see. All right, Kyle, you're unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet and Pat. That was really interesting discussion. I just wanted to follow up on David's question there, and I was wondering specifically about the ground effect. When I see pelicans fly, they're so close over the water, and I was wondering if there's anything that you can kind of pick up from the GPS signal there. You said when there's hurricanes, they're not moving at all, but what about kind of less wind? Just enough chop so they're not able to use that ground effect. I think there was a calculation 20 years ago that the ground effect saved them 30% of flight costs. And I'm wondering if they can't use that effect, perhaps they can't forage as far. I mean, is there any relationship between maximum distance and wind speed beyond that kind of really large scale effect of hurricanes?
I looked at wind speed just basically in the context of when they're flying over land or when they're choosing to make their migrations over land, and it looked like they were choosing pretty strong tailwinds to make overland migrations. We didn't really see that same correlation with migrating over the Gulf. There's not, at least as far as I could see, and this is just kind of a basic flyover. I never did an in-depth analysis, but there wasn't any particular correlation when they were flying over the Gulf. So I don't know if they're just flying high enough to not really be subject to kind of the low overwater winds when they're migrating compared to when they're foraging and they're right over the water flying in groups. But they do seem to use the wind, particularly when they're flying over land. I don't know, Pat, do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's a really good question. It's something I think that would be cool to look at with finer scale tracking data. So something like we were trying to use a Matakis to get at some questions about altitude and times at different altitudes, but just didn't have much luck. If you've got some ideas, I'd be happy to talk about it more because we still have ample access to colonies relatively easily, and so it's something we could still pursue.
But there might be some possibility they're using different heights, I guess, different altitudes off the water at different, depending on wind speed.
Yeah, because you also see them, they'll almost, do what raptors do. They'll soar up to, a couple hundred meters at times to the point where they're out of sight. And then you'll see them kind of glide down. And so their use of the wind is really unique, I think, compared to a lot of the other coastal species we deal with. And
yeah, they seem to use thermals as well as wind, I would say.
Yeah, so from a marine spatial planning or conservation standpoint, then how they might interact with wind towers should they be built in that zone, I think could become really, really important.
Great,
Thanks a lot, Kyle. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Not seeing any hands immediately raised. So with that, I think we'll end off that paper. Thanks, Juliet. Thanks, Pat, for joining us. Stay tuned while we go on to our next paper. Just going to mute you both if that's all right. And I'll unmute Teri, who's joining us from Canada. Hello, Teri. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks.
Good. And I think you've got, I think John Green is on here, I believe, at the moment as well. He is too. I'll unmute John if that's all right. John, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm cooking a dinner at home, but I'm available if necessary. I suspect Teri won't need me to help though.
Bon appetit.
Yeah. I hope you have got like a beer or a wine with you as well.
Well, I mean, any minute, just listen out.
All right, David, I'll send it over to you.
Yes, as a second paper, we'll be speaking about social associations at sea in Australasian Gannets. The paper is led by Teri Jones from the Seabird Ecology Group at University of Liverpool. It's a collaboration with Zurich University and John Arnou's group at Deakin University in Australia. And the reason why I was really keen to do that paper is that I'm fascinated by the Pop's Eye Gannet colony of Melbourne, and for about the last 10 years, because I remember Tanya Pick's PhD on that colony. It's a tiny site. The colony has been established in 1984, and there's very limited space. So I guess there's about 100 nests. And actually, Teri, I couldn't work out whether it was 100 individuals or 100 nests during your study. Maybe you could just clarify that point?
Yeah, so I think in some years the colony is a bit bigger than it was in 2015. I think 2015 was a bit of a bad year, actually. So at the time that the loggers were deployed, there was about 100 breeding pairs, so just over 50 active nests. I think there was a lot of early failures that season, so there would have been more at the beginning of the season, but those were sort of the birds that were still going at the time during chick rearing.
Okay. Okay,
so it was quite a small colony sampled that year. It has been bigger in the past.
Yeah. So I really like the setup because it's more or less experimental. It's a bit like with the radar tower on Middleton Island. The really good conditions to handle big questions about ecology, and in that case, it's about to what extent do at-sea aggregations indicate active social choices. So that's really a good complement, I think, to the paper we had last week about seabirds raking the ocean. And of course, that all has wide-ranging implications for the evolution of foraging and coloniality in seabirds. So at that colony, what you and your colleagues did was to equip 85% of the birds for the whole colony. So a big tracking effort in parallel. And then on the GPS tracks, you looked at colony co-departures, commuting movements, foraging movements together, and then colony co-returns. And you did really extensive social network analysis. I'm saying this now just in a sentence because we don't have that much time, but obviously there's a massive effort behind all this, and you demonstrated that obviously individuals get together more often than expected by chance. So that's a good starting point. And then you showed that for each individual, 10% of commuting was performed in association. I found it really surprising because I was expecting a much higher percentage. Maybe we can come back to this afterwards. And but you showed that for 30% of foraging co-departures and co-returns, there were association. And this level of gregariousness was consistent at the individual level, but there was a lot of flexibility in the choice of associates. You also found that there was only a small tendency for associations formed during foraging to then lead to co-returns or co-commuting, not very often led to co-foraging. And that, of course, questions all the ideas we had about the use of public information. So overall, we could call this a persistent but opportunistic social structure. And that would be the equivalent of humans often following people as they drive off to the supermarket, but then other folks within the supermarket and generally not caring much about whom they follow. And one of the things also you demonstrated for this small colony was the importance of local enhancement, which seems to be important. And that's the equivalent of seeing from a distance people at a food truck and then quickly moving forward that source of potential food. So congratulations on that fairly massive and really neat study. And of course, there's a really big methods background to it. And while reading it, I thought, well, the authors must have had really quite of a headache to define what is an association and to set different thresholds. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, thank you for that nice summary of everything. So yeah, the setting of all those associations, defining all these things, that was a big bulk of the work I've been doing in the last couple of years. And so really, there wasn't a lot of stuff that I could find in which to base this off of. So it was a lot of going through and sort of trying to define and what would be an appropriate association level to look at for each of these different behaviors. So yeah, we tried to look at a number of different thresholds and different things.
And
in the story.
so you built up on previous work, for instance, the PhD of Andrea Thiebaud, who had set some thresholds in terms of this distance and time of co-occurrence. So I saw in the method section that you tended to build up on this.
Yeah, so we tried to build up on what stuff there was out there on people looking at how far gannets might be able to see each other and how far they might respond to one another, and then also just looking into pulling out associations that have some sort of biological meaning. So we basically spent a lot of time working on those thresholds, I think.
And the thing I was trying to figure, so the way you said things, you can say that birds were probably within the same area, but it could be really hundreds of meters. And that sort of excludes really small scale patterns such as formation flight. And I was wondering, and you point to this in the supplement, and I was wondering whether by doing so you sort of excluded part of the commuting which could have been done in groups, or at least you excluded formation flight.
So I mean, the thresholds we use, they encompass a lot, the area, so it should include any individuals that are very close to each other, as well as individuals who are at the farther end of these thresholds. Because the commuting flight was sort of observed in quite a low proportion of commutes, I think using anything smaller would have actually led us with very little data to work with, just to actually make any conclusions from, because we would have had so few interactions then. So sorry, I didn't phrase it quite correctly. I was just trying to wonder if at some stage you put the cursor to much tighter associations to try to put a metric on the proportion of birds which were doing formation flight, because I had the impression that in Gannets it could be quite important. Yeah, and so I know from observational stuff, you do see gannets flying quite close to each other, especially returning to the colony. They quite often, at a lot of colonies, they return in these lines of birds. And we didn't pick up, we didn't really tease apart whether the overall social commuting associations versus the smaller proportion of really close ones. We didn't look at that. I felt that to do that properly, I would have needed more resolution on my data. So a lot of the things that look at sort of those really fine scale movements of commuting flights, joint commuting flights, have looked at things like pigeons, homing pigeons, where they can have data loggers taking GPS points every second, and they can look at the actual shift in like heading on these scales. And so because gannets can fly so far in a 2-minute span, I think that even with this resolution of data, it's not good enough yet to look at those really, really fine scale collective motion things that we might be seeing. So no, I didn't look at those in this paper now.
Yes, and I really like the setup, which is more or less as an experimental setup with free-ranging seabirds. But I was trying to figure what happens if you try and scale up what you found to much larger colonies, foraging over much larger areas. For instance, if you think of a tiny island with millions of seabirds and then the vast Southern Ocean around it, do you think that this would modify some of the things you find?
Yes, I think that's a really interesting question. And obviously, the difficulty of looking at these things in large colonies is the fact that the colony is so large that you can't concurrently track this level of individuals. So I think that it's difficult to say for certain what would be going on, but I think that as the colony size gets larger, there's more and more opportunities for them to be interacting because you'll have more individuals foraging at any given moment. So I think that our measures sort of show that these are actually important even when there's only this many individuals at a time. So if we add more individuals and add more opportunity for individuals to have these associations, that they might have an even more significant effect and be more frequent in these really large colonies. And so they could be of great importance to certain species anyway, in large colonies that, especially if there's benefits to those groups at sea, if they are able to increase their capture rate by being in a group. And obviously that will vary with different seabird species that might have different foraging methods, but there's some papers that look at how gannets diving one after another might have improved capture success because the fish school is disrupted by the previous dive. And so these foraging associations might have benefits in that way, and therefore in a larger colony with more opportunity, we might see an even greater effect of these. But I think that given that in my small colony, I demonstrate that these associations are really flexible, it doesn't matter who an individual associates with, I think that will carry over into a large colony, because as the colony size gets bigger, it's even less and less likely that individuals will be able to or bother to distinguish between other individuals. And so we'll see that these flexibility in association should be similar in large colonies, or even more so, where individuals
and
should
I know
just
that
be flexible.
yeah, and I know that for instance, Japanese colleagues have been trying also massive GPS deployments on penguins. I believe it was at Sydney Island. So I think there's also an additional on a paper on that you might want to check on. I have a third question, which I'll keep on the back burner, and I'll hand over to Grant. But thanks a lot for the really interesting study.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Teri. This is pretty cool. I gotta say, I really enjoyed the network analysis that you guys did. It's not something you see very often in Seabird papers. I was curious as to if you got any idea of, say, individuality in the birds. Were there birds that were, kind of loners and didn't really interact very much with other birds? And what was kind of the prevalence of that in the population?
Yeah, so we do see that there was individual variation in the level of sociality that individuals had. And so there were definitely certain individuals who had far less associations, and particularly in different foraging stages. So for instance, in the commuting association set, on average, individuals had about 10% of their commutes were social, but there were individuals that didn't commute socially in my data set, a couple, so they just weren't in that network. They're just off to the side being not commuting with other individuals. And so we do see that there is some variation here where some individuals are more social than others or interacting more often than others, and others are doing so less. And so we see that individual variation. That's what one of the advantages of the network approach lets us sort of look at this at the individual level. And we see that with this individual variation, these individuals are showing consistency in it. So we see that over the different foraging stages, individuals that were more social in commuting were also more social in foraging, or more social in colony departures. So we see that there's some consistency in their behaviors. And then I looked a little bit at this in terms of, so the different habitats that the individuals use, and we see that some of this might be driven by the fact that in the bay, it seems like it's less useful to be to forage in groups, and so these birds might be displaying these less social tactics, which would account for some of this individual variation.
Yep, I think you just nailed my follow-up question there too. But I guess there's an interesting kind of social aspect or social studies aspect to this. If you were to scale it up, does the size of the colony impact individuality? Are we, say for example, the difference between us country blokes and those city dwellers, right? If you're in a larger colony, do you tend to be more social or less social? And does that have implications on how well you can generalize to, where birds are maybe foraging? So if you were able to track 50% of the birds at a large colony versus having to track 85% of the birds at a small colony. So I think that's quite slick. The other question I kind of had for you too was around whether or not you saw any difference in, say, whether or not birds were leading the way back. Were there any particular birds that were, or any patterns in individuals that may be causing birds to come back? Sort of like how sheep, it's always that one sheep that drives the flock. Was there anything like that in your data?
So I have looked a little bit at picking out individuals who might be leading a commuting event or following in a commuting event. And so I have another paper in the works looking at some of that. I haven't particularly looked at whether there's individuals who are leading the way back to the colony after foraging. I would be interesting to look at. I haven't pulled out just the sort of return trips and seeing if there's individuals that drive the departure. I did think it would be quite interesting to look at sort of individuals' departure decisions from foraging patches, whether I could look at, as one individual departs, how does that cascade through other individuals at the foraging patch?
It's a really strong prediction, that there might be leaders out there leading flight formations, and the whole idea is that if there are leaders, this is precisely their culture, so to say, which may lead to foraging asymmetries and asymmetries in seabird home ranges. So thanks, Grant, for that question leading to one of my favorite subjects.
Of course. I do find it interesting. I mean, you do see that kind of behavior, I guess, in other species, those pioneer birds, right? The ones that, I know it's a little bit different in that they're sort of the ones that go off on their own and pioneer a new colony. But you can imagine that there are, there's got to be birds with leadership qualities that are the ones that guide the way for the larger group, the larger flock. And the kind of work that you're doing, Teri, is absolutely lends itself to being able to look at those kind of questions. And like I said, I think there is scope for doing something interesting regarding colony size as well, and how that impacts individuality and personality in birds. So
yeah, I think it would be very interesting to look at effects of colony size.
So I think we've got a question from Virginia here now, and then so I'll open it up anyways to questions from the audience. And thanks for that, Teri. That's super interesting. I really liked your paper. Virginia, you are unmuted. Go for it.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, hi
Loud
Teri.
and clear.
Congratulations, I loved your paper. I was wondering, and I maybe that was Grant's backup question, whether there were nearby colonies from the same species or other species, and whether you have information as to whether birds segregate between species or use the same areas.
Yes, so that's a really interesting question. So there are other colonies of Australasian gannets. There's one further up the coast a ways, which I believe is actually where the Pope's Eye colony came from originally. There's been some work on looking at both of the colonies, these colonies together, and they don't overlap. I mean, they overlap some in the foraging areas, but they don't overlap overly. So they do have separate sort of foraging areas that they seem to preferentially use. And I think the birds, particularly using Port Phillip Bay, seem to be from Pope's Eye colony mostly. So other birds don't seem to be coming in there. There's definitely in the area, there's other species of birds. There's penguins that the gannets likely interact with in different areas. And it would be great to know more about, these things, but it's very difficult to do, to sort of assess how these things, with so many different species, how all these interactions play out. But there's definitely other birds and dolphins and things in the area that will share foraging areas. As for the other gannet colonies around, they definitely, if there's some foraging overlap, so they definitely can forage together, but in terms of at least the colony departures and returns, that's going to be strictly limited to the colony because, that's their pool of information. But yeah, definitely local enhancement could happen with other gannets.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the information center, like if they actually learn at the colony where to go to forage from other birds.
Yeah.
And particular, since you just said that the Pope's Eye colony comes from the other colony, I think it's very interesting to try and understand whether they go foraging in a particular area because they learn that they have to go there somehow, or it's just environmental. And I don't know, particularly that setup of a small colony coming from a larger one, I think it's super interesting to study that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think there's been a few studies that have come out of this system that have looked at both those colonies and their foraging areas. Some work from our colleagues at Deakin that look at those and the level of foraging overlap between them. But yes, to my understanding, there's some, but they do tend to forage in different areas.
Super interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, V. All right. I did have a tiny question, which was about environmental variability and whether or not you could track whether or not environmental conditions or weather conditions, more specifically, actually impacted the behavior you were seeing.
Yeah, so that's something that we did think about a lot, but didn't really fit into the project time frame that I had. So it was definitely something we considered a lot and something I'm interested in. So it would be very interesting to see how these associations might vary with different different weather conditions or different environmental features. So yeah, I would be particularly interested in looking at that, but no, I haven't looked at any of it yet. So. Okay.
And we've got Juliet's got a question for you. So I'll unmute you. There you go, Juliet, you're on.
Yeah, so I apologize if I just overlooked this, but I was wondering if you looked at, I know you looked at the different strategies once they're out foraging and how sort of spatially segregated individuals differ, but is there any spatial structure within the colony? And did you look at that at all as far as like whether birds nesting in closer proximity to one another were more likely to associate away from the colony?
Yeah, so that's something, again, I definitely thought about looking at, but the colony itself, the birds all nest very much on top of each other. Like, so the platform is quite small and the nests are all very close together. So there was some difficulty in sort of sorting that out, in that all the nests were very close to one another. So there was kind of like, where is the cutoff? Everyone was quite visually within range of everyone else. So it seemed that that might be an interesting question to ask in a more spatially structured colony, where individuals might have less information because they can only see the individuals directly nesting around them, or there's a range of individuals they might be able to pick information up from. Whereas I think in this colony, because it's a very flat, dense platform where everyone's basically nesting on top of each other, that's a bit less.
And there's a paper in MEPS by the group of Steve Vautier testing this for northern Gannets, the incidence, so to say, of subcolony structure. And as far as I remember, there was no incidence. And we tried out also in Cape Gannett and didn't find anything really exciting in that matter. And I also agree that with POPSI, you know, the birds, they can probably all see each other. So I don't think there is much of a structure.
That's
Cool. Thanks, Juliet. Dimas has a question. You're up, Dimas.
Well, hello guys. Congratulations for the two papers. Very interesting. But actually, Juliet already asked my question. I was interested on how physical proximity between the nest would be related to the social connections, and I think it's particularly interesting the co-departure and co-returning layers, because this means that the birds have similar schedules. The individuals that are linked to departing and returning to the colony have similar like living schedule or returning schedule. That was just what I was wondering, but it was pretty much answered already. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimas. All right, Mary Claire's got a question now. You're on.
Hey, congrats on the cool paper, Teri. I was looking at the graphics and I noticed how the foraging site was somewhat a bit sex specific, and that only males appear to forage in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah.
But then it wasn't much explored, or sex differences weren't much explored, or weren't in the results or anything. So I was wondering whether it's because there weren't any differences between the sexes in the way that they behaved with the flock.
Yeah, so I did some preliminary stuff looking at it, and overall, other than the fact that there was a strong difference between the Bay individuals and the non-Bay individuals, there didn't seem to be other strong differences in sociality between the sexes. So it seemed to be more driven by what spatial habitat they were using rather than the gender. So it's obviously a bit confounded by the fact that only males use the Bay. That's why I kind of didn't present both, is because I was looking at this, it seemed to be driven more by the fact that certain individuals use this different strategy rather than a difference between males and females in their sociality.
And do you know why it could only be males that are using the Bay?
So I don't know exactly why. It does seem like because the Bay is closer, they might be excluding other individuals somehow. So if this area is closer and they can catch what they need in it rather than having to go elsewhere, it might be preferential to forage there, but it might not support the colony size, so individuals go elsewhere as well. But I'm not sure what it is about like what they do that excludes the individuals from these areas. But I think there is some other work from some of the colleagues at Deakin who have looked a little bit more at these sex differences in their habitat uses. But I'm not sure if they've identified any particular thing other than males use the Bay.
All right, cool. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mary Claire. All right, Divi, do you have any more questions for?
Yeah, a methods question I was keeping by the site. So
saving the best for last.
Well, no, I wanted to discuss more general things first. Of course, you know, to tag 85 gannets within, I think it was 3 days at such a small site that must have been a real mess. How did you deal with this? Because that would be really my worry.
So I actually wasn't involved in the fieldwork on this project. That was John Arnold and his crew at Deakin. So I think it was, what happened was that the devices were put on a delay, so they all started at the same time, but I think the capture might have actually been over a few more days than that. I'm not sure. I'd have to double check with John. But I think it was within a week they went out and captured all the birds. I think that is one other thing that's very unique to Pope's Eye, is because the colony is a completely flat platform, the birds are all very close together and they're very used to people. They don't really freak out like other gannet colonies. It made it a lot easier to do this sort of mass capture of them all and to put all the devices on it. They've been doing smaller deployments over the years before, so they were very familiar with all the site and everything, and then how to get these birds tagged, quickly and safely. So I think that this was just a ramping up of their previous years where they'd done smaller samples from this colony. But I think it might be a lot to do with the features of the fact that Pope's Eye is quite a unique colony in that it's very accessible, very flat, and the birds don't seem to freak out as much as other places.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
John has just turned his camera on there, so I'm going to unmute you for a second. There we go, John, you're on.
Yeah, I mean, as Teri said, she basically did a kind of COVID-19 style project here where she did an amazing study of field behavior of birds without actually visiting the field site. But I did go there a few years ago, and yeah, just to support what Teri said, I mean, these birds are nuts. They're often surrounded by scuba divers and snorkelers and recreational anglers and other boaters. And if you get on the platform, the gannets, they come for you. Like, they start attacking you when you go on there with, knee pads and knee protection, because they're really going for every part of your anatomy. So I think as David said in his introduction, they're very tight on space. They will defend these nest sites very closely. So that certainly facilitates you picking up birds, equipping them, they'll go back to their nest because they're so valuable. And I think that certainly helped to facilitate doing the actual fieldwork part of this.
That's cool. Yeah, it's quite interesting when you get these set of colonies that get totally attuned to people being around. They just, you do see a lot with common terns as well. I mean, there are certain common terns, being aggressive as they are anyways, and tend to go for every bit of bare skin they can find. But yeah, it's quite fascinating, and that has interesting implications, I think, on how on the results of any study. If these birds are attuned to people, then how does that impact? What does that mean for them as a group? Are they do they have a different behavioral structure than what you would find in perhaps a more wild population? Oh, I'll unmute you again, John.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I'm not sure how what's good about this study is we managed to catch every bird. So, that variation is kind of eliminated. But I think there's interesting, and I used to work on penguins, and the great advantage of a penguin is you can pretty much catch whichever one you want within reason, because they're not going to get away from you as long as you don't chase them downhill. But I find it interesting working things like cliff nesting birds, where you're trying to noose them, so kittiwakes, guillemots, razorbills, where if you're tagging birds, you're often restricted to the birds you can catch, rather than a completely random sample of the population. So I certainly think in some studies our samples are influenced by that kind of factor, and that's why sites such as Middleton, where Kyle Elliott's working at the moment, is really unique and really different, because again, you can get every individual from a cliff nesting population. I think this kind of potential sample bias in studies more broadly is something that isn't necessarily often discussed.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that, John. David, do you have any more for Teri?
No, actually, I'm done.
All right.
Very interesting read, and I think I'll have supper soon.
Yeah, I think you should. Thank you, Teri, and thanks, John. Teri, congratulations on a really cool study, and Juliet and Pat, thank you for joining us as well today. just before I go, for those of you who were who participated in the Twitter conference there last week, there was an email sent around to remind you to fill out a little survey, and the survey is going to be used to help come up with improvements for next year's event, which is going to be chaired by Anthony and Natty. Is that right? Yeah. Yep, getting a nod from Virginia, so that must be true. All right, and with that, I'd like to. I'd also like to remind you, Pat has just written down in the chat there that there is a Pacific WSU town hall today. Pat is going to be answering some questions about the Third World Seabird Conference, which, as most of you know, was postponed until October next year. We did have one for Atlantic participants there yesterday, which is now up on YouTube in case you've missed it, you want to catch up on the question and answer session. Yeah, so there'll be a Pacific one as well today for those of you who want to participate in that. And Virginia has written in the chat that you can find the form that we were just talking about for the Twitter conference on the @Seabirders Twitter account. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming and thank the authors of these really cool papers. Next week we'll be back at 06:30 GMT, nice and bright and early, and I guess we'll leave it at that and let you guys get about your day. Thank you again, and stay home, stay safe, wash your hands, don't get sick. We'll see you all again real soon. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.